Hello, and welcome to the Internal Comms Pro webinar. In this series, we'll be talking with the experts while celebrating the work that makes you an Internal Comms Pro. I'm Gina Morvek. Employee experience is a subject that shifted a lot in the past few years. Employee expectations have changed, and while some companies are taking these changes in stride, others are still figuring out what their next step should be. You yourself and your company may fall anywhere on this spectrum. Wondering what your next step should be? Today, we're talking with Advita Patel from Calm Edge Rebels and Jonathan Davis from Happeo. We break down the current state of employee experience and the steps you can take in your company to help make it a good one. All right, welcome the both of you. We're so excited to have you for our first episode of this webinar. So to start off, we'd love to tell our guests, just give us your name and what it is that you do.
So I am internal communication and employee experience consultant. I own my own business called Comms Rebel in Manchester in the UK. And I'm also the co-founder of A Leader Like Me, which is an organization aimed to help underrepresented people progress in their careers and also help organizations cultivate cultures of inclusivity. And I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. And Jonathan?
Yeah, same here. Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to share the stage with Advita. I'm a big fan. Heard a lot, so I'm a little starstruck. I'm not gonna lie. So, so I'm Jonathan. I've been with a company called Happeo. We make an intranet that basically what our specialty is to solve information chaos. I'm the product marketing lead there. I'm a former internal communicator myself. Before I kind of switched to the dark side of marketing, let's say, I've had to go through the trenches of building intranets by myself and trying to run comp strategies without buy-in and then figuring out how to do all of these things and really building the plane while flying it, as people say. And now I've been here for a while. Love doing a lot of research into this field. Very passionate about making this work. Very convinced that this is the let's say, secret weapon of companies these days that they don't even realize most of the times.
hmm Well, again, it's great to have both of you on the show today, and I'm glad I was able to make that connection. So, today we're here to talk about employee experience. I think it's safe to say over the past couple of years, especially since COVID, that the idea and concept of employee experience has changed, or it might be more accurate to say that employees' expectations in their job or in the workforce have changed. And there's a lot of small factors that are affected by that, whether it's how employees feel they should be treated or even just the location that they're at. So just based on your experience or what you've seen, what are some major changes that you've seen in the way of employee experience?
I think there's been a lot of people have recognized during the pandemic the importance of what work life balance is. I think, to be honest, some people have. And the tolerance level of poor behavior is no longer there, to be honest with you. And I think the conversations I've had with individuals is that they recognize there are more things and more important things that they want to add value to. And they are not prepared anymore to go into organizations and just churn out work without recognizing or understanding what contributions they are making. And you hear, there's been all sorts of, you know, things gone out there like the great resignation, the quiet quitting, and things like that. And I think they've always existed to some extent, but now people are more open to speaking about it and sharing their experiences, and they're not hiding it. And I think that's the difference really over the last couple of years. People have become more courageous, bolder. They're not prepared to just put up with it just because it's a job. They recognize that they've got more options available to them as well. And they're holding leaders accountable as they should. And I think that's causing a little bit of conflict in some places because before, when you had the symbolism of leadership in organizations in face to face, you could demonstrate quite clearly who the leaders were just through various cultural behaviors, right? So if you walked into a boardroom, the CEO sat at the head of the table and everybody else sat around them. And when they walked in, people kind of paid attention because they commanded that kind of presence. But as soon as you go onto screen and you're all kind of, you know, potentially zooming in or Skyping in on a Skyping. Oh my God, that's a proper 2010 platform, isn't it? Not Skyping, Teams, I should say.
It was. It
That
really
proper is
was.
a 2010 platform. But I think you're on an equal level at that point, and it's difficult through that kind of hierarchical symbol to prove your leadership, I would say, and you have to put more effort in. So people have now, I would, have are on equal path to leaders and are demanding more from them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm so on board with that, and that's definitely very noticeable. It's a massive trend that's also gone on in society, and that's fed on into the workflow, right? Like the right to speak up, the right to have your opinion heard, and the channels to do so. That's very different from how it used to be versus how it is now. I think another thing that we've noticed, and I've done a lot of research into this over the past, starting at the end of 2021 into now, and the things that we've seen that have been changing, and COVID accelerated this, but wasn't necessarily the cause, right? A couple of the things that we've seen changing is that employees now demand autonomy within teams. And keep in mind that I'm coming kind of from, I'm biased towards the tech industry. So I will admit that in. But for fast moving companies, companies that really want to shift a bit more in an agile way, teams demand autonomy, so they don't want decisions just made top down, and that necessitates a very good, strong structure of communications, top down, bottom up, two-way street. Second, they demand a best-in-class employee experience, so it's not just about an employer taking care of an employee financially. There also needs to be some sort of form of emotional care that's being instilled within the employee experience. And then third, and I think that this one is obviously, well, it's very obvious, but we see hybrid work has basically become a demand. People demand the ability to be able to work from home for X amount of days a week. And I'm already seeing that employers, depending on the sector, obviously, if you're a lab technician, it's going to be difficult, right? But again, tech sector speaking, if you don't offer that capability, and the reason behind it really truly is because I just don't know what's going on if I can't see you at your desk, you're going to have a really big competitive disadvantage in the war for talent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you touched on this a little bit already, Advita, and I'm curious, Jonathan, based on your research. Um, so again, when companies were faced with these changes, again back during COVID, depending how fast these came up, it made sense that they were probably scrambling a little bit to figure out what was the best decision to make for their company and for their employees. But where we're at, kind of past past COVID, quote unquote, where we're at now in 2022, um, would you say now that companies overall, do you think they're finally getting on these changes? Do you think they're finally getting it, or are you still seeing some struggles with companies fully willing to accept some of these things that employees are looking for?
There's definitely a combination of both, Gina, in this. I think there's organisations who recognise the power of what the three things that Jonathan shared there. One of the most important things I've seen is the autonomy thing and the power to make those decisions. And the organisations who are caught up with that and recognise that are definitely thriving more. Because I've always, in the years I've worked in internal communication, one of the challenges I've seen is the lack of autonomy given to colleagues in delivering work, and the micromanaging and not trusting people to deliver against their objectives drives really poor behaviors. And those organizations who are using excuses like, I need to see people in order to see that they're delivering against the objectives that have been set, they are going to lose talent fairly quickly. And if they don't catch up, it's not a choice, I would say, at this point, it's a necessity if you want to attract and retain talent in your business. And I think those organizations who are ahead of the curve already set that scene in the, pretty, I'll probably say between 6 to 12 months after the initial COVID hit. They recognized probably a year into it, 2021 time, that they need to make changes quick if they want to retain talent. And to Jonathan's point, people want that choice. People are now demanding flexibility in the way they work and how they deliver. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's got a daughter who's 23, and her daughter has spent a year traveling around the world, just before she starts university, college. And she's been working through her travels to earn extra money, but not in the traditional sense of working. Before, if when I was at university, working your way around the world was working in restaurants or bars and things like that, as you kind of, want to earn a bit of extra cash. She'd been actually selling stuff on Etsy. She'd been mining all sorts of kind of Bitcoin and all that kind of stuff. She'd invested in NFTs, and this is a new world. This is a new way of working now, and people are now want more income streams and different ways of working. And to attract a very intelligent individual like what she is, organizations are going to have to compete against that flexibility of her, being able to go to Bali and log on in the morning for half an hour and sell a few digital downloads on Etsy, and then check out how her Bitcoin is performing and do a few, shares and things like that in that, and have that flexibility. And that's the challenge. And I think those organizations who don't understand what that looks like in terms of fluidity, they're not going to have a choice. It's either you have to do that to thrive, otherwise, in about 5 to 10 years time, you're not going to exist.
Yeah, dude, I'm so with you. I'm seeing that 100% also in job roles. Those are becoming far more fluid than they ever were. It used to be you get pigeonholed into one thing and that is it, but employees also demand opportunity now to grow outside of that little box that they have been put in. And also importantly, employers should cater to that, not because it's the right thing to do for the employee from like this sort of moral high ground point of view, but also it's the right thing for your business to do. Talent is incredibly hard to find. Talent is also incredibly flexible. You can make way more use out of them than just the one thing that you hired them to do. And then definitely also to your point about the autonomy thing, look, I recently I dug up some stats. There are 305 million companies starting every year. Of those 305 million, 100 million are new businesses. Of those 100 million, I think about 13.5 million are startups. In other words, and I'm talking basically roughly tech startups, right? All of those stats tell you one massive thing: competition is increasing everywhere in every market. That means that you need to move way faster than ever before. And this is something, sort of like to the point that I was trying to argue before, where I really feel like internal comms and well structured internal comms within that employee experience can truly be a competitive advantage, because if you communicate internally better than your competition, you'll be able to outmaneuver them better because you can adjust to market changes quicker and have everybody go into the same direction. So that autonomy just ties into everything that goes on in the market conditioning. The employee experience part is way more than just being a good employer. It's also about really truly capitalizing and getting the most out of your talent. And the flexibility part is just hybrid working is also for employers incredibly beneficial. It can just from outside of the normal bog standard things of decreasing overhead of office costs or anything along those lines. Like Happeo is a great example. We should have upgraded to a bigger office if we stayed in office maybe 3 years ago. But because of our hybrid setup, we don't have to. That's of course also a bit of a cost decreasing factor, right? That can be very beneficial, and that's just super granular, peanuts in comparison to the overall massive list of benefits that it brings, and catering to exactly what employees demand, as Advita explained very well, right? That flexibility, diversifying their income streams, a different way of looking at work and life. Those things, they're so important.
You're so spot on there, Jonathan, about the internal communication and the power internal communication can have to bring some of these kind of experiences to the forefront of keeping talent and retaining talent. And in my experience, I'm yet to, I mean, there are obviously pockets of incredible communication functions out there, but, I am still seeing pretty dire comms still and the channels that are being used. And if you think about our experiences outside of work, and how we are now, we're exploring things like AI and virtual reality and augmented reality as well, and personalization. You can walk, the number of marketing emails I get that know what kind of things I want to buy from their store, which then tempts me to, and I feel cared for and I feel valued because they have paid attention to what I am purchasing and what my kind of shopping habits are. Even our social media platforms that we use, they're so clever. in terms of the algorithms. They pinpoint you to the right stuff that you want to see and hear. And obviously, there's advantages and disadvantages of that, but there are definitely things we as internal communication professionals can pick up in organizations to create that more personalized experience so people feel included, they feel like they belong so they can thrive rather than just survive in a business. And I think, and not think, I know and believe that internal communication can be drivers behind this. And we just don't take advantage of that as much as we should be.
So I think that one of the things that I really noticed within internal comms is that it's kind of a shift, right? Like it used to be the former journalist who really knows how to write news on behalf of the company, send that internally through usually a combination of email and an intranet. And that was your tool stack. And that's what you did. And that's what didn't get you super far, mainly because you were always very reactive and you got pigeonholed there. And what I'm seeing now, especially from the kind of like segment that I've done a lot of research into, is that internal comms isn't necessarily just a thing that's owned by the internal communicator. They're more like the facilitator of making sure that comms flows within that company very well. And it can be that it's part of a role of somebody who sits in the people and culture team. I've seen it within operations. I've seen it sit in between all of those teams. I've seen internal comms report into marketing. Like the part of where they report into has become like that used to be a really important discussion to me maybe 3 years ago. Now I stopped caring because it's not relevant anymore where they sit. It's about what they can make accomplish. And one of the things that we've really started seeing for these companies that really want to move fast and have success is stop taking ownership of it and let people do it themselves. Let them build out their space. Let them carve out their voice. Let departments run and decide when they send news. Obviously, like be there to facilitate for them, help them, remind them, help them become better communicators, but help other people be successful at that, because it's not something that should be super centrally owned. You're there to ensure success. You're not there to own it.
Perfect. Well, you both already kind of dove into what my next question was going to be, so we can just jump right off of this. So, as internal communicators, as they're trying to help facilitate this employee experience to help, like you said, elevate their teams, what are some other ways that they can go about it?
So I think it ties into the core part of letting go and making sure that other teams can autonomously do it themselves. That means that essentially the role that I see of a modern internal communicator, and it doesn't matter if you identify as internal comms with your job title, or you have people and culture in your job title, anything along those lines, right? I think that modern role is you take a step back, you shift, you monitor, you see what's going on, you spotlight the things that are really important, you help others bring that to the attention of the company so that their voices can be heard in a way that they feel they did it themselves. And I think that's really crucial. One of the core things that I heard a lot during the pandemic as one of the kind of like tactical things that were going wrong in part of the employee experience is a lack of companies who had to shift remote to share and celebrate wins together, company achievements, things that they did. And those can be so important to team morale, to company morale, and also to getting other people involved and engaged in doing that. Right? Um, if you're if you sit within the IT department of a very large 10,000 person multinational corporation, you're less inclined to care a lot about what massive deal the sales team closed within a different continent. The thing is, if you make those things visible, you do start caring about it. You become more involved in the organizational success, in the financial success, but also in the sales team's success. And guess what? As the IT team, you're also there to help ensure their success, because eventually that's what all teams work towards within the company. So I really think that a lot of it, to take a very long kind of roundabout way to and come back to it, I think that a lot of it comes from, if you really want to do things well, stop trying to think that you're the only instigator and that you're the only one that can do things, and look at what other teams are already doing but are currently under highlighting, because that's where the gold is right now.
And to add to that, one of the key roles I believe internal communicators need to kind of shift into is coaching and supporting and guiding leaders. To Jonathan's point, 20 years ago when I entered the profession, it was more about your writing ability and how well you wrote and how you could shape the stories. And that is still part of what we do, right? We're storytellers, and we encourage people to tell those stories in their voice, though. And that's the change. When I started 20 years ago, it was a very journalistic approach about interviewing people, writing their stories, getting them to sign it off and posting on the internet, or through an email or through a written newsletter. Now it's definitely more about the authenticity of that voice. So you may encourage them to tell their stories, but in their own way. And people have now got their own micro platforms to be able to do that quite well. And our role as internal communicators is to instigate that, but let them crack on, because everybody wants that authentic voice. So we need to appreciate our role as this coach, as a guide, as someone who has the privilege of having the umbrella view of an organization. And to Jonathan's point, pinpointing where those challenges are in certain divisions, departments, and how we can support them in embracing communication to the benefit of that team. Not in terms of the traditional internal communications with the S, but how do you communicate? How do you encourage leaders and coach leaders to build confidence in the way they communicate with their teams, which is often the failing point of things like trust. And I talk a lot around cultivating cultures of inclusivity and how internal communication professionals play a part in that. And hence why Priya Bates, who's my co-founder for A Leader Like Me, and I are writing a book about it, because we have such a big role as communication professionals to play in that culture of inclusivity and belonging, and what that means. And it isn't about us taking hold of the reins, to Jonathan's point, and directing people, but it's guiding them through, empowering them through confidence, and asking them what does an inclusive environment look like, and what do you need from that to help people belong, because that's what we all want. If we remove ourselves from the performative side of inclusion and diversity and equity, and we talk about belonging, once you feel safe and you belong and you feel included in the conversations that are going on in that business, you are going to thrive, you're going to perform, you're going to be more innovative, there's going to be less sickness, you're going to retain talent. There's so much research and studies out there that demonstrate the impact of that. And we alone as internal comms can't do it, but we together with the leadership team and supporting them can definitely make a big difference. And I think that's where I see, if I had like a magic 8 ball, I would see that's where the internal comms function is transitioning into more of a trusted advisor.
I think another thing that internal comms, especially now that so many companies have embraced the hybrid setup or even have gone fully remote, I think now on the operational side that somebody needs to start taking ownership for. And if you ask me, I think internal comms is very well suited to this. Is prevent information overload. And by that, I don't just mean, oh, now a lot of people are sending more information, right? Because we're all sharing more successes and that type of stuff. I mean, literally, the sheer amount of messages and the volume of it that people have to deal with if you're in a growing company. If you have 20 people, you're probably using a messaging service like, I don't know, name whatever you want to. That doesn't work anymore when you're in 200 people, but often changing from that is sort of like an afterthought. And navigating through that mess is a massive, massive challenge for employees that can be incredibly overwhelming. So the parts of just getting the amount of time that you must spend in those tools trying to look for a conversation that you really need in order to complete a project or a task that you were working on, it's such a massive slog of resources and such a huge factor of inefficiency for companies that want to continue to move fast now. I think that on the operational side, that's something that really needs fixing. And I also think that we need to take that into scope of the employee experience, because overwhelming your employees when you have to communicate digitally most of the time, that is not a good employee experience part.
And this is why I encourage, and I'm surprised when I spoke at the IABC conference in New York a couple of months ago, I asked a question of how many people undertook a communications audit to try and understand what type of channels they've got in the organization. And nobody. I think there's about 55, 60 people in that room, or maybe one person or two people, but nobody else had ever done a communications audit. And that took me by surprise. And, if anyone is listening and they haven't really done one before, I would highly consider doing one. Because this, without knowing what communication channels are out there and how people are communicating, not only the channels that you own, but the channels that other people own as well, you're not going to know how to direct that communications, and what kind of noise people are hearing, and what's going on. And to Jonathan's point, there is a huge overwhelm and information overload, but there's also, with the access points we now have to information, misinformation and disinformation that is being thrown out there through other people's research, and the information they hear, what without recognizing. And I said this right at the start of this conversation, is that the algorithms on the social media platforms are biased towards the way we use that platform. So we only see and hear things that are relating, that we relate with generally. And then we take that information, whether it's true or not, and we don't do our due diligence, and we share it within our organization. And before you know it, the gossip mill and the disinformation, misinformation is there. And we all know, working in this field in internal communication, gossip moves at a lightning speed compared to the traditional channels that we use, because we have so many processes of sign off before we can put something out there. So if you haven't done a channels audit or a communications audit, then you need to do one. That's step one, to understand who are you communicating with, why are you communicating with them, what are you communicating with them, how often do they get that communication, what's the point of that tool that you're using to communicate, and how does it work, and what's the cost implications, and not in terms of money, but in terms of resources of your team's time. If you're sending out a quarterly magazine, for example, to a team of 25,000 people, but only, if you've got your measures right, but only 100 or so are actually paying attention to it, what value is that bringing to the business?
Yeah, please do a comms audit, and don't just do it one time and then forget about it. Like that needs to be a recurring thing. And while you're at it, that employee engagement survey that you may or may not send out once a year and probably neglect, make that a little bit more frequent. Probably would be my tip. And then the second one, make it a little bit less about, do you have a best friend at work? The famous Gallup Q12 question, which, shout out to Mike Klein. He hates that one and loves calling it out. Make it a little bit more about, actually ask your people, do you feel overwhelmed by the amount of information you get? How much time do you estimate you spend searching through conversations and archived files to get to what you need to do your job? And more questions along that line that actually make impact on employees' daily lives. And if you have an overview, if you did the comms audit, so you know which channels you have, and probably also which ones aren't particularly successful, and from, let's maybe call it an information chaos survey, right? I don't like the employee engagement survey. And um, what the problem is that your employees are facing, you could put two and two together and create a beautiful business case for leadership to say, we need to solve this now. We need to do something about this. This is a priority because our people are suffering from it, and we're paying X amount of euros or dollars on an annual basis for tools that nobody cares about.
I would also recommend doing a stakeholder analysis, right? So you know who you are communicating with. So those three things that mentioned by you, Jonathan, if you can do them three as a very basic stakeholder analysis, a channels audit or a communications audit, which can then lead to a channels matrix, and then deciding that this annual random survey that people send out that have no impact because it's so subjective, and changing that into a bit more of a pulse check or something that adds a bit more value and takes away, in my experience, people focus so heavily on the numbers rather than behaviors. Looking at the behavior change that pulse check can bring you quite a powerful business case that demonstrates impact communication can have across the organization, rather than it being quite performative or just a post box. And suddenly you become this strategic leader in the organization that's adding value and making a difference when you have those tools at hand. And you're not throwing, my favorite analogy is, when you don't have any of those tools or those kind of frameworks in place, you are trying to hit bullseye blindfolded, and hoping that you hit it at some point, and you're just not going to, it's just not going to work at all. And especially for those organizations that have 150 plus people working there, because the culture changes as you grow and adapt and move forward. So just please do a comms audit at the very least. It will make a big difference to your work.
If you take anything away from this webinar,
Yes.
it's to do the comms audit.
Definitely, yeah.
And the survey,
And the
please.
survey.
Yeah, but not just only once a
Thank you.
year.
So to wrap things up, I just want to ask one more question of you both. Based on this research that you both have definitely done, or maybe even your own experience, I know and I'm sure a few of our listeners slash viewers are people that learn best through example. So based on your research, or what again, even what you possibly have experienced, have there been any case studies or examples that you've seen of companies or organizations that are doing these steps properly and that they're benefiting from it? And then flip side, have you maybe seen those case studies or organizations or examples that they're not heeding these steps and they're kind of suffering the consequences from it?
I think in my experience in the organisations I've seen do really good work are the ones who are very open and transparent about communication to colleagues. So I'm using Twitter here an example. What we saw through the whole Elon Musk fiasco, if you want to kind of call it that. One thing we can say about the leadership team there that they were very, from what I witnessed, they were very open with the comms. They shared the letter even when the handover happened between the CEOs, Jack and to the new CEO. His name is it Parag? His name. Sorry, it escapes me. But they did that. They were quite open with the exchanges that they had, the letters that they wrote to the employees. They answer questions. They're not shying away from the questions by the looks of it. They were quite open with all of that. Same with I saw similar kind of behavior through Google as well. And it is quite tech. I do honestly think that tech firms seem to be a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to employee experience. And I think that's because they have got experience in customer experience, right? And they know what good customer experience looks like. So they try and replicate that with employee experience. Organizations that haven't, I believe, are not doing as well as they could be doing are the folks who, and I'm not going to name and shame them on here, but you would have seen plenty of LinkedIn posts about certain behaviours, are the ones that, well, actually, I will name and shame one. I don't know, for the more international audience, there was a huge fiasco here with P&O Ferries, which is an organisation that decided that they were going to tell people that they were fired through message, I think it was through email or text message or whatever, and they found out through the newspapers. And it was there was no empathy shown whatsoever on that. And even when the leaders were called out about it, they still were not apologetic, about how they did it, how they managed it, and they brought in freelancers and suppliers to cover those posts that they've removed. And that whole behavior was tragic. Watching people turn up to the gates at work and the film and the camera crews there, seeing them experience that they've just been let go and fired without any courtesy. That is that kind of behavior is unacceptable. And I think more and more companies need to understand that that is not going to wash anymore, and you are going to get called out for it publicly for doing that. But those are when trust is low, those low trust cultures where people are not trusted to deliver the work and they're not respected, and empathy is low. They're the ones who I would say are going to not exist, in my opinion, in probably 5 to 10 years' time. Whereas those like the worlds of Twitters and Google and places like that, the tech folks and others, Sky is another one actually that comes to mind. Sky is a cable provider in the UK, and I think they're pretty well known globally. They've made some pretty bold statements for the last couple of years, which I appreciate, and especially me being a comms rebel, I love that. I love the boldness they take and being unapologetic about who they are, and being quite clear about their vision, mission, and what type of people, if you're not aligning with our belief about what inclusivity and belonging means, then this probably isn't a place for you. So I love those kind of organizations that are quite bold in behaviors, because I think you need to revolutionize comms now and the way we communicate, because people, to Jonathan's point earlier, there's a lot of noise out there, and it's distracting, and you need to attract the right people.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there are companies who consistently do it wrong, and I operate in a market, so I'm not going to call out any names. But
Understandable.
there's a company that it's quite well known that I've seen, and I've seen this in a trend. They're not the only ones right now. the tech world is kind of going through a very weird, like the bubble has burst, as a lot of people like to say, right? What we're seeing quite a bit is people being laid off after periods of high growth. Um, and that's terrible for those people. What I've also been seeing is people who have very recently been hired on their second day of entering the office getting laid off while they're on their probation term. And that, I think, from any business ethical standard, sends the wrong message. Actually, it sends the message that you don't care about your people. And you probably don't if that's what happens, because if you come in on your second day and throughout your entire hiring process you were there, almost from the moment that you started that hiring process, it should have been known that these layoffs are coming. We should freeze all hiring. This should not be happening. That person should never have been hired. They had to, in the case of one story that I read today, this person had to relocate. Granted, it was within Europe, so it's maybe a slightly big step, but still. They had to relocate, and then they had to find a new apartment. They have to take care of all of their logistics and all of the things that come with starting a new job in a different country, only to be told on the second day, that's it, you're out, which basically means that in this case also their visa was going to expire. So that's, you leave one good job to join another, you get a good offer and you're excited about it. The second day you come in with full energy and then you're told to go home. That's the worst thing ever. If layoffs need to happen, it's an unfortunate, almost fact of life. That's something that also I think anybody will go through at one point in their career, but not this way. This is wrong on every level. So that was one thing that I've seen that's just terrible. Companies that I've seen do it right. I'll name a customer of ours is really good at this, Randstad SourceRight. They're a professional services company, which means that their people are basically their product, right? So they know how important it is to invest in people intrinsically. And you see this in how they treat their staff. When the pandemic first hit, they immediately started to survey people to figure out, how are you feeling now? So they could establish a baseline. Figure out, okay, if these numbers decrease, then at least we have a baseline from before the start. Halfway through the pandemic, they would survey their people again to figure out, how have things progressed? What are we doing wrong? What can we do better? They would try to crowdsource people's experience to organize things like mindfulness webinars or yoga webinars. And I'm talking start of the pandemic. So they were way ahead of the curve. They weren't caught off guard. They just literally shifted and went with it, and not just from a business perspective, but also from an employee experience perspective. And I have a lot of respect for them for doing that. Anatoly, their head of internal communications or internal comms manager, sorry if I say your job title wrong, she's one of the best in the business exactly for that reason. So they have a fantastic team that just, they're a really good example of how you do things right.
It's the organizations that empower colleagues to make decisions that are the best, right? And they're the ones that thrive completely. And if you can empower your colleagues to make decisions without micromanaging or asking them to sign several hundred pieces of paper, they're the ones that have the greatest impact reputationally, internally and externally. And when Jonathan was talking, there's an energy company in the UK that, it's notorious, isn't it, when somebody sadly passes away in your family and you have to kind of cancel all their direct debits and all that. It's tragic in terms of how you have to do it, and you have to get lots of proof of the death certificate and all that, and it's not the best experience at all. And so many companies get it wrong. But there's this one energy company in the UK that, because of the empowerment they've given their team to make decisions on giving the customers the best experience, they send bunches of flowers, cards, and we're thinking about you. That personal touch can honestly make such a difference, not only to the customer that you're working with, but also to yourself as somebody who's made a difference to that person's life in that moment by having that caring behavior. And you can only do that as an employee when you've got permission from your leadership team and your organization for that empowerment. Look, we trust you to make the right decision for our customers. And we're going to give you autonomy to do that. And you don't need to seek permission for us, because we trust you to do the right thing. And that, in my experience, are the organizations that are thriving and will continue to thrive because they trust their people. And those who continue to do that, I'm sure we'll see them in 2, 3, 4 decades' time thriving.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to connect with our guests or dive into the topic even further, check out our associated blog page at www.internalcommspro.com /blog. Until next time, I'm Gina Morvek.